Good morning. I'm going to start with words of gratitude for bringing me here. This is my first time at the university, and I have long heard many wonderful things about the work that you do here. I have good friends that have come and participated in the summer workshops, so when I received the invitation, it was an immediate, enthusiastic yes, and also because this work that you're doing is so incredibly important to me and to all of us. And I would be remiss not to extend my condolences for those of you who have been affected in some way by these terrible floods. I have to say it didn't get much news in the United States. It seems to be competition for attention to climate disasters these days. But when I was first writing to Ljubljana, I was telling him I'm stuck inside my house because these wildfires have put us all under quarantine in upstate New York, and I don't know if you saw some of the scenery. It was very apocalyptic, to the point where even after being inside on the second day, my hair and my clothes and everything smelled like I had been at a campfire. So it was really surreal. It's my first time living in a wildfire zone. And then I write, and he tells me about the terrible floods, and I'm headed to another climate conference. Maybe some of you will be there in Hawaii in November. And my God, 100 people have been lost to these fires, and I just read today there are 800 people still unaccounted for. So I think it sets the tone that we'd like to be meeting ahead of the worst of these disasters, but we have to be really sober in the reality that we are following them now. That demands some very serious and difficult conversations about what we mean by green transition. And the ecofeminist perspective offers a somewhat different understanding of that, which I'll discuss today. So I was asked to just tell you all how ecofeminism responds to social justice, and I initially prepared something that is more of a didactic talk about the development of ideas and activism in this field, and then with, because it is an activist movement as well as a school of thought and an analytical framework with some strategies for application that are very salient to ecofeminists. I want to, after hearing my colleagues speak yesterday, I thought, oh, check, check, check. They've already discussed many of the things I was going to say and offer as ecofeminist suggestions, so that's really good. I can build on and add to. And then I want to interject some of my own research findings as of late as an activist in the United States, because we're talking about the US as a major driver of this process, as a major offender of these processes. And I want to emphasize how difficult things are on the ground, and in the years to come, I'm dreading the next election, to be honest. So as was said, my research is in cultural dimensions of global social movements, and this means that I've looked at a lot of different kinds of movements, not just environmental movements, but the movement to stop foreign military training in Latin America, the globalization of nonviolence and the role international NGOs play as emissaries of nonviolence and as protest consultants in local movements around the world, some of the problematic dynamics of that, and then the role of invisible, politically invisible women in peace movements in the worst of all times, in civil war and in the periods of genocide. In terms of environmental movements, I've done city-level research on climate policy planning, and I was on my city's board for drafting a green plan, and I've worked with a number of groups which I'll tell you about later. I'm currently interviewing experts of all kinds around the world on what are the forbidden topics in these policy arenas that we are not allowed to talk about because they are offensive to power and unpalatable to what appeals culturally in the green transition. And then continuing on in my research on women in civil war, I followed the women's peace movement in Liberia after the war and the challenges to building peace in a post-war society And I don't have a Hollywood ending for either of these studies. It's rather dire. Here I was led to look more closely at the role played by extractive industries, international extractive industries, who now own more than 50% of the land under industry concessions. So it's hard for women to build peace and equal rights for women when they're dealing with these deeper structural inequalities as a nation. I recently edited a volume on extractive politics, conflict, and peace building, which is open access online in the Journal of Social Encounters, to try and learn from my colleagues about how these issues are unfolding around the world and what peace scholars can learn and what peace builders can do in the face of these very difficult kinds of conflicts. So let's start with some imagery. I don't know if we have any Ursula Le Guin fans in here. Yes, okay. Because I'm going to use this to frame my talk and also to define the era in which the term ecofeminism was coined and the movement ecofeminism came about. And this is from one of her short stories. She's a prolific author, but this is from one of her short stories called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which she published in 1973. It's a story that has gripped readers for decades with its element, clement turned haunting premise. The story begins in a quaint but lively city at the dawn of the summer festival in a city called Omelas, where everything is so joyful and quintessential it reads as utopian, an intended interpretation the writer discloses to her readers, just before presenting its very sobering caveat. All that functions well and all that brings cause for delight and celebration in the town and its people depends tragically on a terrible reality kept hidden in a dark and dirty basement. This is the child who lives in squalor and in pain, in the space between long stretches of neglect and intermittent abuse, spending most of their days alone, barely surviving on the meager cornmeal and grease they bring her regularly and the distant memory of sunshine and her mother's affections. Somehow, and for some reason, the child is more than the archetypical scapegoat that sometimes appears in dark fantasy and fictional tales. The child's pain and suffering and utter dehumanization constitutes the foundation upon which the existence and functioning of the town depends. Now, everyone in the town eventually learns of this despicable reality. It's not hidden from them forever. They're taught at the age of reason, between the ages of 8 and 12. Some come to witness it for themselves. Others mourn just upon imagining it. Those who learn to live with it, and Le Guin gives us the impression most do, go through a process of acceptance through legitimation, ideological justification, or repression, denial, or dismissal, in order to be able to tolerate that the near-perfect situation of the town would be wiped away entirely if not for the tragedy of the suffering child. But then there are those who walk away from Omelas forever, after witnessing this horrible tragedy of this one suffering child. So there are many interpretations that have been devised to make sense of the author's intent and the many possible meanings of this short tale. I present it because it contains within it imagery of the kind of system dynamics that have been the object of a targeted ecofeminist response to injustice against people and planet. These include first the juxtaposition of what seems to be at once a magical good life, but which comes with a double-sided reality, a cost that can be well hidden, though neither completely ignored nor erased. At best, it can be explained away or avoided for as long as possible. Second, it involves the tragedy at Omelas as multi-layered and deep-seated. It goes beyond the sheer violence between the person who abuses this child and coming back and forth and the child's experience. It's not a story of individuals. It permeates the system so that not just a part of the grand scheme of the lifestyle of the citizens of Omelas would be lost, but the system in its entirety would be unraveled if not for the suffering of this child. Third, as the thesis in the title signals, those who walk away from Omelas are both paradoxical to the status quo and their fate a mysterious unknown from the perspective of being still within Omelas, indicating that A, another layer of tragedy exists in the overwhelming impetus of most to stay and carry on with this obscene abuse, and B, the only surety those who walk away can be promised is moral vindication. but what is to take the place of the life of luxury of Omelas is unknown. One need believe that what is unacceptable must first be denied. Finally, and relatedly, the great challenge in Omelas could be portrayed in two ways juxtaposed. It could be seen as how to live with an uncomfortable reality in the most comfortable way possible, or it could be confronted as how to abandon the system of exploitation when it is all so pervasive in its entirety. And more so, a fundamental dimension of this challenge is how, when thus far a steady but minority few have chosen to resist, certainly not a critical mass. So, the term ecofeminism was coined in the same year by French feminist Françoise Dubon, and she writes about this concept and her understanding of how it addresses the problems of our age in Feminism or Death. She makes a couple of assertions here. First, she sees that patriarchy treats both women and nature as subservient and inferior, and therefore that when we're thinking about how to understand the causes of violence against women and the environmental crisis and the dynamics of those processes, they have common origins in this system of domination and othering and subjugation that makes the violence possible. And then she concludes that an ecofeminism is necessary to resolve both of these crises. So they were writing at the same time. I don't think they were in communication, not to my knowledge, but they came out of the same movement. And this is a women's liberation movement, sometimes called the Second Wave Movement, which had overlapping interests in socialism as an alternative to the exploitation of industrial capitalism and the poverty of class stratification, and environmentalism, as well as anti-racist movements, anti-colonial movements, and so forth. And so women were having these sort of comparative conversations about the systems that underlie these very comparable processes of violence and exploitation. So what I want to do now is turn to sort of the history, the overview of the development of thought and analytical inquiry in ecofeminism, with a little bit of history of how movements informed that theorizing. It's very much a movement where theory informs praxis, and praxis informs theory. And then I'm going to emphasize through a sociology of knowledge perspective how this particular perspective is distinct from some of the other perspectives addressing the environmental crisis. And then building on these revelations, I'm going to delve into the implications for practice and some strategies. So we'll start with a bit of history. I'm seeing that this may not be the correct slideshow because there's a slide missing here. But that's okay, I'll talk through it. So it grew in the 1970s, as I said, a convergence of activism and theorizing and analysis. And there were many women involved in anti-nuclear movements. Is a really important originating space for ecofeminism. Here we have a woman scientist who was part of the baby tooth survey, where they were collecting teeth from around the continent to see how nuclear testing had followed the pathways of calcium in the babies born in the 1950s and 60s, simply by being exposed to their mother's breast milk. And the finding is that it does have a residual effect. It has been written into our blood, this chemical age, and this study organized by women eventually led to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. But there were many movements against militarization and military buildup around the world, against the connections between industrial chemical proliferation and public health. This is the Seveso poisoning in Italy, and these are the women at Greenham Common in the UK. At a military site, you had women forming blockades at nuclear power plants and missile construction plants, and you had women advocating for the public health of other women and their families and through a transnational solidarity. And then I don't have the pictures here, but the women's Greenbelt movement in Kenya
led by Wangari Maathai, and in India, the Chipko movement, were very formative to the thinking about how to make the connections between violence against women and violence against the planet. So among early formative writings in ecofeminism was Rosemary Radford Ruther's 1975 New Woman, where she's talking about the common causes of sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, environmental destruction, and other systemic forms of violence, and how we can take these on in a different way through these insights. Green Paradise Lost by Elizabeth Dodson Gray talks about God above and man above, as opposed to women and nature below, and how these are seen in the ethos that fuels the systematic violence against women and the planet. And really foundational to thought in the field of ecofeminism is Carolyn Merchant's 1980 study, The Death of Nature. Now, she was initially trained as a chemist, and then she turned into a historian of science. And what she did in this study was she looked at the discourse at the beginning of the scientific revolution to see how the natural world was conceptualized and how those assumptions about the natural world were baked into the scientific enterprise. And what she was able to show was that there were many scientists advocating for a reverence in science, a respect for what we don't know, and for the integrity of living systems, and that is not the paradigm that won. Rather, it was this mechanism and this reductionism that has informed the scientific revolution to date, and we see this in reducing natural elements or natural processes to particular functions defined by human interest in the industrial age, and thinking about the natural world as parts of a machine. My teenage daughter is doing her thesis actually on the legacies of mechanism and reductionism following the death of nature. So it is still incredibly relevant today. You see it in the ways we practice industrial production and chemical management. You see it in agriculture and the chemical management of the ways we feed ourselves. And you see it in healthcare and the biotechnology industry and the bioengineering of the human body and human health. Okay, so in the 1980s, ecofeminism takes off, and there are many movements that continue to influence this field of thought. Native American sociologist Winona LaDuke began studying the effects of uranium mining on Native Americans living on reservations. So we're going full circle with the ill effects of nuclear power, from the mining to the testing to, obviously, the after effects that are detrimental to life. And you see myriad applications of ecofeminist thought being brought to different problems that women are facing. German sociologist Maria Mies's Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale is influenced by a political economy analysis and interjects a feminist framework, looking at the intermingling of the history of global capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism, and now how they have relegated women to what she calls a process of housewifization, whereby they are made to be the cheapest of consumers and producers. Mies's work led to a more layered understanding of the sexual division of labor and a critical examination of extractive capitalism's ill effects on the environment. Additional works of this era, which would come to expand the ecofeminist framework in new ways, were penned by Australian sociologist Ariel Saleh. I understand you are just now translating, I think it's this book in particular, into Slovenian. This is also a really formative work in the field. Australian philosopher Val Plumwood, who had been active in deforestation and advocating against deforestation, also began to pose really important questions about how we treat women, humanity, and nature through a common ontological framework, and the role of using the sex-gender distinction to subjugate both women and the natural world. And Vandana Shiva also writing in this era is going to further, in fact, nearly everything she writes incorporates some aspect of Carolyn Merchant's work on the ontological basis of the scientific revolution. And early on, she's going to take on some of the delusions about the Green Revolution as this Trojan horse for global corporate profits. Instead of this sort of white savior trope saving millions of people, she's going to follow the legacy in some of the areas where it was first implemented and show the suffering and the poverty that now lives in its stead. And continue to address issues of food security and ecological well-being of vulnerable populations in the so-called developing world. In fact, her first book, Staying Alive, came out of a conference in which she was in conversation with Wangari Maathai about the issues facing women in the most marginalized regions of the developing world. It's a really important book to read to understand how the worldview of those forwarding what we have now collapsed as science, which is an understanding of how the natural world works, and technology, which is an initiative to intervene in those natural processes and impose some sort of new order onto those natural processes, how this collapse has been infused with a particular ethos that has disproportionately disadvantaged the developing world. Many new conversations developed in journals like Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy, and today I would say Capitalism, Nature, Socialism is a really important place for these conversations on what ecofeminism means in the face of current challenges. So these have addressed all kinds of aspects, distinguishing ecofeminism from socialism and other forms of ecological civilization thinking, the role of spiritualism or just holding sacred some of those relationships with nature and with each other that have been disregarded in industrial capitalism, and understanding what is distinct between ecofeminism and postmodern or neoliberal feminisms. So I'll talk a little bit about Ecofeminism as Politics, this really important book by Ariel Saleh, where she's making clear that the same challenges arise in ecofeminism as in feminism when postmodern approaches to gender differences cloud what could be concrete commitments to women's liberation from patriarchal domination, sexism, racism, colonialism, extractive industrial capitalism, and all the ecological harms caused by these. And she wants to build on Marxian concepts like commodity fetishism, the world of these mystifying symbolic exchanges, which disguises real energy exchange, and false consciousness, and the ways that colonized peoples in the global economy are written off through false consciousness of this false narrative of helping them catch up, which we know from historical studies has never happened and isn't really baked into the design of the global development regime. However, she wants to follow in the sociology of knowledge work begun by Merchant and probe Marxian thought a little bit deeper on overlooking some of the man-nature dualisms and the assumptions about the division of labor and the formal economy, reducing women's labor to invisible and undervalued, and rendering the natural world, which sustains all industry, invisible and undervalued. So whereas a Marxian analysis might say labor is the source of all wealth, she would add that nature is the source of all labor, and women play a fundamental role in nurturing human community, making labor possible. So there are other deeper steps on this chain that are rendered invisible and that have to be taken into account when we think about what do we do next in this current paradigm. She's also going to challenge this technological fundamentalism that is also embraced by socialism. It's something socialism and neoliberalism sometimes have in common, depending which part of the spectrum we're talking. She says, for in Marxism too, humans' instrumental mastery rested on man's objectification of others as matter and resource, canceling nature's subjectivity and potential partnership. So I think one of the most important concepts that comes out of this book is this concept of embodied materialism, which really encapsulates how ecofeminists understand the problems we're facing and propose solutions to the problems we're facing. So it is historical in its understanding of the significance of how othered labor has been structured into the current global economy, in its exploitation of workers and devaluing of different peoples, and the exploitation of planet, with the effect of culture being integral here. So this is the slide I typically show to my students to illustrate. It's from the 70s, of sort of the socialist feminist thesis here. And I would ask, how many of you were brought into the world through the labor of a woman? And if you were lucky, she cared for you for several decades, or someone did. Someone did. And how much were they paid for that labor? So when we talk about transitioning use value and exchange value into a new economy, we're already written out of that equation. And so what is the starting place? An ecofeminist would ask. Here's an updated version. Okay, and here we have women in the sweatshop labor movement sewing the Che Guevara t-shirt. I'm from Cuba, I love the Che Guevara t-shirt, but the reality of the t-shirt industry we've already discussed. We have formerly colonized peoples making the technology for us to network our social movements. The immigrant is painting the toenails here because he's an enlightened gender non-binary person, and feeding them, giving chocolate and coffee and so forth. And an important distinction between ecofeminism and neoliberal feminism is the acknowledgement of the ongoing objectification and exploitation of women and nature through the growing industry of pornography and the sex trade. And it's always very depressing to talk about, but some of my current work is working with survivors of the sex trade and their activism for an equality model legislation that doesn't just legalize the sex trade and allow those with the privilege of dispendable money to exploit women's bodies and women's sexuality, but gives them a structural pathway to leave the sex trade should and when they want to. Okay. So another important work here is, again, Maria Mies's subsistence perspective. It's going to present a historical analysis that argues ultimately that another world is possible through traditional knowledges of indigenous women living in subsistence-based community. And this is a hard-to-swallow argument here, but it's important. She challenges the ethos of global industrial colonialism that values only production, which leads to accumulation. And she's right to point out that production, which has led to subsistence, which is how human communities have survived and thrived for so long, is not valued in this market system. Again, this housewifeization is what happens to women whose work is made invisible. And she's going to draw on case studies of communities in Africa, Latin America, and Europe that are sustainable ecologically, and in terms of human security and meeting their needs and providing for each other. So let's see. I would say ecofeminism today has carried on many of these insights and is addressing the evolving nature of our crises. The new talk of the Anthropocene or the Plantationocene or the Capitalocene and all of these words we have for it, and what an ecofeminist perspective can add, thinking through men and masculinities and how that has translated into some of the issues I heard someone discussing in the last question and answer session. And Ana Isla's Climate Chaos is an important work that is showing how ecofeminism in the face of climate crises in 2019 is further ensnared by the money system and the extreme polarization of wealth and power, which we have already discussed. New developments in this biopiracy and corporate genetic modification of life, which is ongoing, and in-depth case studies of activists working at the front lines of food sovereignty, anti-mining, and land displacement movements, with insights from traditional and indigenous knowledges around the world. So finally, Vandana Shiva has continued to write in the field of ecofeminism prolifically since the 1980s, with over 28 books covering myriad topics of importance to ecofeminists. And I should add, it's not just Vandana Shiva, but most of these writers are also activists working at multiple levels of organization in terms of policy advocacy in international organizations in their states and at the local level. Vandana Shiva's work is exemplary, she has covered the history of global development programs and their impact on women and indigenous peoples, the Green Revolution's effect on food sovereignty and poverty in India, food security movements, monocultures, and biotechnology, and what it does to the earth and what it does to our health, and how it compromises our ability to feed ourselves and take care of ourselves and each other. And the farmer suicides have already been mentioned in India. The concentration of wealth and corporate power in global agriculture and resource management, biopiracy and the manipulation of life, water privatization, which is a growing concern, and democracy and ecology in the climate crisis. So if you haven't read, it has a different title here. This must have been an earlier version, but it's not too old a book. I think it's 2019 or so. If you haven't read what is now called Oneness versus the 1%, I don't think it's the best title to sell what's in it, which is a really in-depth social scientific analysis of how the concentration of wealth is now poured into industries that threaten life in every way possible. And going back to, again, she always builds her work on Carolyn Merchant's findings. She discusses biotechnology and the control of the human body, as well as the control of agriculture and our food, how it compromises the integrity of the ecosystem and our health, and of course, the expansion of chemical controls and industrial manufacturing. So let's talk about what's different about an ecofeminist framework from other approaches. First, it's to emphasize that it's a systems analysis. I think sometimes, and I should say ecofeminism, like feminism, means many things to many people. For some people, it might mean just including women in the conversation and including women in representation of policymaking and thinking about the impact upon women in the environment when some of these environmental decisions are made. But it goes deeper than that. The ecofeminism I'm talking about, the embodied materialism of Saleh and Merchant and Shiva and others, is a systems analysis, combining the concepts of ontology. How we think about the world and how we think about each other matters, of how we treat the world and how we structure our social institutions. Biology, and this is a point of contention, which I'll get into, but that there are real known biological impacts of our decisions and of our culture, which translates into the ways that we behave and organize our social institutions. And it is not just an analytical framework, it is an ethos, it is a movement. And so, as my other colleagues have emphasized, it is important to think about how to care for each other in this age of impacting, compounding crises. Okay, so first, ecofeminism is considered scientifically grounded feminism that centers a biological, albeit diverse, nature of human species as one ultimately dependent and part of the natural world that sustains it. This is a subtle distinction, but it's one that sets ecofeminism apart from other kinds of socialist frameworks and analyses. And I think there's two ways you can think about humanism versus more than humanism, because we talk a lot about these differences these days. You could think about humanism as a very focused analysis of the human condition and the human situation in terms of these inequities and the environmental crisis. And if you refract the lens, you understand that, of course, we are dependent upon our environment and our fate depends upon the health of the environment. And so there are really two different levels of analysis. But then there's a humanism that is truly human supremacist and positions the entitlement of the human species to the natural world in a way that is mechanistic. And I think this is important when we're thinking about what the green transition is, who it's for, and what we want to happen on the other side of that transition. So it's also different from a neoliberal and postmodern approach that is ultimately human supremacist. So I'm going to give an example from this Yes magazine special issue pictured here. And it was an online forum featuring the authors of several of the contributions called An Ecological Civilization. And panelists and audience members wrote in to discuss how to get back to a culture of reciprocity, a sharing of the commons, all the things we're discussing at this conference. And Indigenous ecofeminist Winona LaDuke interjected to clarify her understanding of the commons based on the Anishinaabe concept of aking, which she says means the land to which the people belong, and aking amen, the very land to which I belong. And she explains this as a fundamental difference of relationship. It's not the land which belongs to us in common, she clarifies. So following in this vein, one facilitator adds in the words of Shiva, who contributed to the writing for the special issue but could not make the spoken forum. And she quotes her talking about these entanglements between the cultural and the material, stating, the way you design the world in your mind is the way you design it in reality. And when you design the world as dead matter to be exploited, you will exploit it. But if you design it with recognition of interconnectedness, you will nurture it. LaDuke also spoke about the harms caused by Wendigo economics. Wendigo is another Anishinaabe concept for greed, known to throw ecosystems out of balance, where postmodernist and post-structuralist feminists embrace women's right through a commitment to limitless freedoms. Ecofeminism looks towards traditional and ecosystem science knowledges about the harms of disregarding limits and disregarding the freedom for us to survive equally and in community. So it's a choice of freedoms. Okay, so in thinking about the criticisms, perhaps the most common charge of criticism against ecofeminism is this charge of essentialism, that the framework presumes a fixed biological function and destiny of women. This began in statements which draw upon the historical role women have played in the community as mothers and as carers of the community, and overlooks the embrace of biodiversity, and that extends to us, the human species, who can choose to parent or not, who can choose to be in same-sex relationships or not, and so forth. So I think it's a really shallow, sort of knee-jerk, postmodernist, libertarian critique, but I think far too much ink has been spilled in defending it. And then the second criticism is whether or not a discussion of limits leads to a situation of scarcity. And this gets into discussions of, is that doomerist, and is that alarmist, and so forth. And that, for example, to take Mia's book on subsistence perspective, is that pushing scarcity thinking. And if you pay more attention to ecofeminist thought and ecofeminist activism, it is based on the feminist precept of fundamentally rejecting these false binaries of either extreme, exuberant luxury, abundance, or scarcity, and embracing that there are other kinds of ways to live fulfilled and happy lives. Again, my colleagues spoke eloquently about this already, and to rethink the kinds of wealth that avoid the excess and that can be embraced in a more sustainable human cultural relationship with each other, spending time with our families and our loved ones in good health and happiness and in communion with nature. And then a final charge against this approach may be that it is simply impractical. And that is correct. It is impractical for the current paradigm. And so in the sense that green transition means for some people, how do I continue to live the life that I prefer and that I'm comfortable and power it sustainably? It's not practical for that. It is altogether a movement against growth-oriented global capitalist neoliberalism. I think filmmaker Julia Barnes, she's a deep sea activist. She organizes against deep sea mining and produced the film Bright Green Lies about some of the illusions of green technology, which I'll talk about in a minute. She sums it up really well at the end of one of her films when she says, the wrong kind of question that we're asking right now is working towards what's politically possible. And I understand that we want effective strategies, so I'll address that as well and talk about people power and how to build people power. But she says instead we also have to be asking what's necessary for the health and well-being of the ecosystem and Mother Nature. So I have pictured here, have you seen this planetary boundaries diagram? This is the work of Johan Rockström and Will Steffen and others on the 9 planetary boundaries. Oh, I'm sorry, you get your bullet points there. And we talk a lot about climate change and what to do to lower emissions and curb climate change, or at least lessen the effects of climate change. But climate change is one of 9 of the ways that we could transgress the planetary boundaries for human life and for all life. And we know hundreds of species are going into extinction on a regular basis. So we can look at where climate change stands, and there is increasing risk. We've already transgressed what is considered the safe operating space. We're all in agreement about that here, but we also need to talk about fresh water use and our access to water. And we know who will be immediately benefited and disadvantaged in the privatization of water in the face of threatened access to water. We have to talk about ocean acidification, upon which all life depends, including our life. We have to talk about biogeochemical flows and the limits and the impacts of mining of all kinds. The overproduction of novel entities, look where we are on that. And that is, I don't know if you saw this study a couple of years ago, there are more human products on the planet in terms of mass than natural things. Okay, so sit with that, I think, and that's a good response to the scarcity thinking. It's a matter of distribution for an ecofeminist and not producing more en masse and to scale. And so scientists have gone to the furthest reaches of the planet and found traces of our plastics. And we all have these plastics running through our blood and so forth, as well as biosphere integrity and the fact that we need a biodiversity of species to survive, and we have already transgressed some of those limits. So it's important to think about all of this when we're thinking about the ecological crises, which I prefer to say, instead of just climate change, which is also important, and they are related. So I'm going to pause and add some of what might be characterized as that doomerism here, because I want to talk about how difficult it is before I talk about the solutions when we're thinking about the offender nation, the worst offender nation, the United States, and how to green transition in the United States. We've got the political, which I'll discuss in a little bit, but let's just take the structure upon which we depend. 75% of goods supplied through these large trucks, okay? And we're a big nation. I just looked it up before this talk. It says 77% of European goods supplied by trucks. Millions employed in this industry, so people's livelihoods are invested in this. And the US has over 5 times more trucks on the road than the next largest truck-dependent nation per capita, which is China. And I want to refer you to the work of Alice Friedman. She was a transportation systems engineer, a global transportation systems engineer. So she has insight into this very complex and very precarious structure on which we depend. She's also the granddaughter of one of the geologists who was very involved in starting the peak oil movement among scientists. So she has that insight as well. And I'm just going to read you the very beginning of this book, just to give you this thought exercise, which I think is very effective, and then I'll give you the takeaway. You don't have to read the book. But she starts by saying, they're not all going to stop running at the same time as in a dystopian movie or novel. But since fossil fuels are finite, if a renewable way to run trucks isn't found, they will stop eventually. And so she gives us this thought exercise of what would happen from a systems engineer perspective if the trucks stopped running. Day one or more deliveries of produce, fresh meat, beer, chilled goods, fresh bread, and dairy products are made to grocery stores, schools, restaurants, and hospitals every day. With such frequent arrivals, there are no inventories, and these goods would disappear the first or second day. For example, hospitals can get syringes, catheters, and clean linen within hours of ordering them, so they have little inventory, and they would run out quickly if deliveries were disrupted. Businesses relying on many daily deliveries begin to run out of various items. Construction slows as materials required aren't delivered. Day two, panic and hoarding begin to empty most grocery store shelves. Restaurants and pharmacies close, construction stops, garbage starts to pile up fast and creates a health hazard, especially at hospitals. We saw the panic and hoarding in COVID, by the way. A little bit. Businesses depending on just-in-time deliveries start to lay off workers, especially in the auto industry or from lack of packaging. Pharmacies get deliveries every day and are already running out of some medicines. Day three, widespread layoffs begin. Sewage treatment plants, sludge and slime storage tanks are now full, and wastewater sludge can no longer be trucked to a landfill or incinerator or biosolids to a farm. Mass transit is scarce. Infrastructure repair and essential services like police, fire, ambulance, telecommunications, utilities, and mail last as long as private fleet tanks have diesel. Banks move billions of dollars of cash, coins, and checks to check clearing centers. Within a few days, ATMs will run out of cash, causing major problems for those without bank accounts and credit cards. Day four. Most service stations have fuel deliveries 2 to 3 times a week, and so they are out of fuel by now. The repercussions start to reverberate globally as 48,000 imported containers per day can't be unloaded off of ships, nor can export containers be loaded in the US. With no fuel, airplanes and railroads shut down, and garbage is piling up everywhere, 685,000 tons of trash each and every day in the US. Day five, industrial production ends. A large proportion of the labor force is laid off or unable to get to work. Travel and recreation stop. Healthcare is confined to emergency services, and livestock begins to suffer from lack of feed deliveries. Day seven, many cars are out of gasoline, and many people will be unable to get work, shop for food, or get medical care. Hospitals will begin to run out of oxygen supplies. 2 weeks, clean water supplies will begin to run dry as trucks are unable to deliver purification chemicals. Only boiled water will be safe to drink. Within 4 weeks, hospitals have 30 days or less of drugs, vaccines, insulin, surgeries, anesthetics, and blood products due to reliance of just-in-time deliveries. If farm tractors are unable to harvest crops, they will rot in the fields. Department of Defense supply chains will break down, crippling the military, in its own words, quote, in ways no adversary has been able to achieve. And we haven't talked about the military yet at this conference, so I'm interested to see what people think or what you're thinking. After 1 to 2 months, coal stockpiles at 40% of coal power plants run out from lack of rail, truck, and barge delivery, causing blackouts in regions most dependent on coal power generation. About 5% of the compressors moving natural gas through pipelines are electric, so natural gas power plants connected to these electricity-dependent pipelines will stop operating as well. In a blackout, fuel pumps for vehicles, ships, and railroads stop because they use electricity. Refineries also depend upon electricity to make gasoline and diesel to get trucks moving again. No, trucks aren't going to stop running all at once, but this scenario presents how utterly dependent we are upon diesel. And she goes on to give a couple of historic scenarios where there has been a serious disruption to supply chains and how that has caused havoc and suffering within those localities. Second, I'm going to follow in the lead of others that localizing agriculture is essential and should be priority number 1 for our food security. Right now, the most irrigated crop in the United States is grass. I'm sorry to say, it's long been near and dear to my heart because I grew up in Florida, where the runoff from the chemicals necessary to keep the grass healthy has harmed our local ecosystem and ocean life. We have mass die-offs of manatees when there are these overblooms of algae and dead fish kills running up on the shores. It's also near and dear to me as of late because I lost my husband in March of this year, my children's father. He was a landscaper, and his job as the low-status person in the firm, the Mexican immigrant, was to apply the pesticides nobody wanted to apply. And everybody knows the jig is up. When you go to the hospital, they ask, were you in landscaping? And what it does to the blood and how they identify these types of cancers is the disruption between certain links in the chain of the DNA, which is how they're designed to kill the plants. So they're doing their jobs. And so it's harmful at every end of the chain, from production to consumption to exposure. And we irrigate grass and grass lawns more than we irrigate corn. And trust me, we have a lot of corn in the US, as we also have already discussed. And here's a cultural element here, because when I asked him the first time he went to the hospital to get chemotherapy, I thought your firm was supposed to be organic. Why were you applying so much of these pesticides? And he says, because the wealthy people in the neighborhoods where I work, they don't like crabgrass. They want their lawns to be perfect and artificial monocropped grass. The irony here is that crabgrass was used by Native Americans for its medicinal properties. It's a diuretic. It's very healthy for you. And so this is what Rachel Carson was talking about decades ago, that if we're not careful, bad things could happen. And I would say we have a very difficult situation here to deal with. Okay, and let me find my notes here. The last example, it has to do with our education system. And thank you to someone also mentioned the education system and how it is geared towards exploitative, extractive, capitalist growth. Yes, it is. I have children in the school system, and it comes up time and again, where I did a study with my students of civics education, which is very scarce in the US curriculum. Why do we have so low voter turnout? We don't have a culture of feeling empowered to vote. And the two-party system, I agree, and the corruption of it is also a problem. But in schools, when kids take civics classes, and we have scanned and coded their textbooks, what they learn is that they should be productive in the capitalist economy. That's what it means to be a good citizen. Now, when it comes to science in the curriculum, as of late, we have two examples from my daughter's 9th grade geography textbook called Prisoners of Geography. I detest the name, but it's a very American title for a nation that has the biggest per capita prison population upon which corporations benefit. We like our incarceration in America, and as Carolyn Merchant and so many others have shown, we think of ourselves as at war with nature, so I suppose it's fitting. It discusses one effect of global warming as the melting of the polar ice caps, and it assures the kids, but there's a silver lining to be found there, because there's all kinds of minerals underneath those ice caps that can be mined and will be profitable for global industry and will power our technologically brilliant society. So this is what they learn in science class. Again, remember that collapsing of science and technology through the ethos of domination. This is her more recent standardized test she was asked to take from the California test, which is supposed to be a global leader in green energy and green transition. It's for an 11th grader. And it gives a short block on science noting, quote, "There is reason to suspect that the ocean floor is a treasure trove of natural resources." It goes on to refer to a UN report on the possible, quote, "peaceful uses of the seabed and the ocean floor," and includes in these so-called peaceful uses the mining of gold, iron, titanium, and other industrial minerals, petroleum, manganese, cobalt, nickel, and copper. The understanding students derive from texts like these is that there's a candy store of minerals down there, if only we can find the way to mine it. So we have really complex problems, to say the least, in terms of how we're going to fix the so-called offender nations, one of the, not the only offending nation, but one of the top offenders of greenhouse gases and all these other kinds of chemical pollutions that are threatening our planetary boundaries and our ability to live safely. So now let's get to the solutions part, and then I'm going to add some challenges at the end. Ecofeminist answers reduce precarity through relocalization. Again, this was said really well by some of my colleagues already, but we reduce precarity by growing security, by localizing our access to healthy food and our access to our essential needs. This is a picture of Vandana Shiva's associated conservation farm and educational institute in Avdanya, which emphasizes seed sovereignty and food security and provides support to farmers in the area and education to farmers around the world. And we know that by relocalizing agriculture, if we're just going to focus on greenhouse gas emissions, which I don't think is all of the story, but it could reduce it by up to 50%. It's a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing precarity happens through a deconcentration of power and control and a decentralization of empowerment and participation. And so we have to talk about participatory democracy in the process. And I'm going to add some difficulties here to achieving this in a nation like the US, but it's a worthy goal. I must add that as a peace scholar, and as I mentioned, some of my latest scholarship has been in trying to learn from other researchers what's happening around the world. If you haven't seen Martinez Alier and colleagues' environmental justice mapping project of conflicts related to extractive industries around the world, it's a very important resource and a very eye-opening source of data. What I find is that when it comes to environmental justice and environmental peace building, which is a growing field in academia, scholars are faced with what could be considered a precarity survival compromise. So you think about a post-war situation where the economy has to be built right away. It has to be rebuilt right away to get access to those essential resources that have been disrupted. And who comes in to offer jobs and investments in infrastructure like rebuilding hospitals and roadways and stores, but the extractive industries who plan to then exploit the people further and profit from them. And Ljubljana and Rustad have an excellent edited volume looking at the impact of extractive industries in post-conflict situations around the world. It's an extensive, impressive amount of study, and what they show overall is that the same vulnerabilities, the same precarities, the same sources of conflict that led to those civil wars sometimes or state-led violence, the corruption and so forth, it's exacerbated. And oftentimes these countries go back into conflict because these supposedly benevolent external actors have not been so benevolent in helping them to rebuild their economy without lining their own coffers as the first objective. And then and I wanted to talk about Stan Cox's work. So when we're talking about relocalization in the US, instead of growing grass, there is a precedent. There's a historical precedent for growing food. And this happened during World War II, and I apologize for the militarist imagery here, but it was necessary so that people could have enough food to survive, to launch this Victory Gardens campaign. And we see this in the US, and Stan Cox in this book here, Any Way You Slice It. Stan Cox is a plant scientist at the Land Institute, which is one of the biggest institutes for sustainable agriculture in the US, turned social science scholar, and he has a number of really wonderful books, and I'll talk about some of his other work in a minute. In this book, he extensively studied Victory Gardens in the US and the UK to show how in a very quick period of time, we were able to relocalize the food economy. And it was led by, not surprisingly, the women. And I've looked in the archives of my own city, and we're talking about an incredible amount of grassroots mobilization at the local level in concert with national level legislation and the state in between to relocalize food and to provide that food security in a time of need. So he says, we've done it before. He's also written some very compelling and useful plans for a cap and adapt program. If the US was serious about lowering its greenhouse gas emissions, here's how we could cap and begin to adapt. But again, it requires restructuring our economy and implementing some of these relocalization programs and some rationing, which is not appealing in a society like the US. However, Cox's work has been taken up by a group called the Climate Mobilization, and this, I think it's interesting and worth a read, the Victory Mobilization Plan. If we were serious, how could we do it, and how could we make sure that people, the most vulnerable to these transitions, are taken care of in the process? It's an alternative to the Green New Deal, I would say, and I think it has some important caveats. Number two was systems of care. So again, we're not essentializing women as the only people capable of care, but in that foundational feminist peace, activism, and work, we think of gender as socially constructed. And what Betty Reardon says, I think, is a good idea, which is that let's think about all of the positive traits we expect women to have and all of the positive traits we expect men to have, and let's strive for those as good human beings. So we're going to push back on the sex role distinction in the gender binary and work for positive human traits and for systems of care that support beneficence. And then again, I think Robert said short commodity chains, and that is a goal of ecofeminist activism with full visibility at every step. So what are the costs to nature and the balance and to the people that are involved in these commodity chains? And I think ecofeminists have much more to weigh into the rush to green energy, which is exploitative and harmful. And again, if you look at the energy returned on investment calculations of many of these plans, they're not actually effective, and they depend on fossil fuels for the manufacturing, production, and maintenance. And the conclusion of Friedman's books is that there is no renewable way to power trucks. And she looks at every proposal. So I'll say quickly, I'm always asked, how do women suffer disproportionately in climate crisis? Yes, they suffer disproportionately because they suffer disproportionately in a sexist, stratified society. And that's not to say it's not important to pay attention to and document. My colleague Farhana Sultana at Syracuse University in the geography department is a political ecologist who has written really important statements on exactly how women are affected by climate-related weather disasters and how they're affected by threats to access to clean water, which is increasingly going to become a challenge. That's important, but adding an acknowledgement of their suffering differently is something different than thinking about their fundamental security in human communities and thinking about how our transition solutions might privilege some women in the world, but leave other women in the world still underprivileged. And Kevin Bale's new book, Blood and Earth, talks about, he documents the relationship between ecological crises and modern day slavery. And his solution is that we have to know who is the person on the other end of our commodity chains. And it's the same thing Maria Mies said in Patriarchy and Accumulation on a world scale, that if women are going to truly build solidarity across class lines and geographical borders and global class borders, then we have to think about how our systems pit us against each other in a system of exploitation. So in my current research on solutions to the ecological crises we face, I'm sometimes blown away by how magical some of these tend to be. This was the, what is it called? The Earthshot Prize, funded by, sorry, I don't remember the prince's name, and his wife. And it's a green hydrogen system that can power the suburban home in less water than the flushing of a toilet. Again, if you speak to people who understand how hydrogen is created and the energy returned on investment to come up with something like this, this might make a lot of money. This might help a very select class of people, but it's not helping all of us, and it's certainly not helping our planetary crises. I really get a kick out of the Helsinki Energy Challenge winner, the hot heart design, which these are floating pods. And so the architects here have proposed that we will use the renewable power of sea waves to power these insulated pods where beautiful biosystems around the world, like the Amazon rainforest, will be recreated, and they show pictures of, citizens at the beach in the Amazon and the Baltic Sea in the middle of winter, powered by their, ocean wave pod. I think we have to push back on some of these grandeurs and illusions when we're asking for whom and what the cost will be of these green transitions. I don't know if I have time. I have a little bit of time to say, from my own research at the local level and in interviewing advocates and policymakers and experts in the US, again, it's not a Hollywood story, but we have a historical challenge in an industrial and post-colonial society. Our cities weren't built up from the commons, like many of the European cities were. It was a settler, colonial, homesteader model. We are very car dependent, and in our urban spaces, which were also built for industrialism, you can see it's quite a mess. So in my activist hat on, I worked with a group called Mothers Out Front to use our position as mothers to care for the future generation and for all children, to advocate for green policy at the local level. In our particular city, we were addressing these gas leaks. So if you know anything about how some old industrial cities, at least in the US, were built, they were built on these pipes that have become rusted, and this is how we powered the city. And this is a map of, at the time, the leaks that we knew about and how severe they were. So you can walk down the street in the US and you can smell the gas coming out of the leaky pipes, because these are 100-and-something-year-old pipes. They are leaky everywhere. And when the gas company is called, like, for example, we prioritize schools. If there was a leak in front of a school, that's very dangerous and it's very bad to health. They would come and repair it, and it's like a whack-a-mole system, if you know this game, and then a leak bursts up somewhere else. So it was a losing game. Finally, the company said, okay, we'll agree with you and build a sustainable energy district where we'll put in heat pumps, again, also dependent upon the gas oil system, but it's more clean on the output. And then they went and told the reporters, yeah, we're just pacifying the activists. We have an all-of-the-above approach, which is we're still planning to expand the gas lines in Massachusetts. We're not slowing down growth or production of gas. So there are political challenges, and you see this across the US, that the gas industry they know that you want to organize with labor. They know that, and they're going and they're supporting the unions. So who shows up to oppose the Green New Deal legislation at the local level? The unions show up, because as the populist meme goes, the carbon they want to eliminate is you. And this is the message among the working classes. And I know it's very important to many of you to build solidarity with and for working classes. It's very difficult in a country like the US, where outside actors with a lot of money and power are building hostility between the unions and the environmental movement. And that's not to disregard some of the privilege and oversights of some of the environmental activists. I get that too. But we see the city used time and again, employed with taxpayer money, public relations consultants, to meet with activists and figure out, what would you accept in terms of a policy that wasn't really effective in the outcome, but it looks really good on paper, such as our green plan for our city, which the manager communicated to the consultant, don't make it too green and too social justice oriented, because if there's flooding in Boston, we don't want the migrants to come here for us to support them. So I have some concern, because my very well-meaning, committed activist colleagues have strategies that are a little bit outdated. Nonviolent protest is beautiful and it's lovely when it's effective. It's also easily co-opted. because it's institutionalized and it's predictable. And companies with a lot of money and resources know the playbook, and they know what to say to pacify and demobilize activists, and they know how to buy them off. And in other parts of the world, they kill them. And it's not just Africa. We have these reports of environmental activists throughout the world. The numbers of murders are horrific in the past years. So we have challenges at every level that I think we need to have some doses of reality in terms of what's possible with technology and what it's going to cost and who's going to pay for it and who's going to benefit, and what kind of strategies are we using in this movement, and how easily co-opted they actually are. So I'll end with that and saying that in addition to asking questions like how can we use less and how can we reduce in certain parts of the world, of course, I'm speaking to my own home country and our excessive footprint on the ecology that others are suffering from. We need to be asking these kinds of questions, and then we need to be taking care of each other now. And there are many wonderful places where grief work and solidarity building and care is being supported. And it's important to take care of yourselves when you're doing this work and to take care of each other. And I'll end with that.